The religion of ancient Greece, a polytheistic and deeply integrated aspect of daily life centered around a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses. Led by Zeus from Mount Olympus, these deities were integral to Greek culture and influenced morality, the arts, and the societal norms through a myriad of myths and stories. Worship varied, of course, from public rituals, including festivals and sacrificial ceremonies at major sanctuaries like Delphi and Olympia, to private offerings at household shrines. These practices also served to unify the diverse city-states of Greece, fostering a shared cultural identity and influencing philosophical thought, which the ancient Greeks are of course famous for. But even as Greek political power waned and Christianity rose, the legacies of these gods and their stories continued to shape Western culture and remain influential in modern literature and art. Now today, we won't be speaking so much about the pantheon of Greek gods, as that requires a very long video of its own. We'll briefly touch upon it, but we're going to talk more about the general practice of religion in ancient Greece, the festivals, the ceremonies, and how exactly spirituality was weaved into every facet of daily life in those times and in that place. But first, let me welcome you to the channel, as each time I have to do. If it's your first time, I hope you're excited to be here, as I'm excited to welcome you. And if it is not your first time and you are returning, well, I'm equally excited to welcome you back for another exciting video. Raise the roof. Now, if you'd like to support the channel, you're already doing it by enjoying the content. But if you want to go a step further, the like and subscribe button are right there. Certainly helps. Further than that, you may look in the video description. Now with that out of the way, let us get nice and relaxed, and we can travel back to ancient Greece together to learn what was it all about. First, we will begin with a timeline focused on giving an introduction of how Greek religion developed, a brief history before we dive into the practices in general. The religion of ancient Greece, with its complex pantheon and equally interesting mythology, of course evolved over many centuries and drew on diverse sources. It's thought that it likely originated from the Proto-Indo-European beliefs, with additional influences extending back to Neolithic Greece. Neolithic is the Stone Age, by the way. Now, the late Helladic Mycenaean civilization, for instance, venerated Poseidon as a chief deity, emphasizing his role as both a god of the sea and of earthquakes. Now, this is evident from what is known as the Linear B records, a kind of writing that the Mycenaeans had, which also mention other recognizable Olympians, though notable gods like Apollo and Aphrodite are missing from these early inscriptions. During the Greek Dark Ages, there appears to have been a significant reduction in the Mycenaean pantheon, with only about half of its gods continuing into later Greek religious practice. Archaeological evidence suggests the religious continuity was more pronounced in regions such as Cyprus and Crete, rather than on the Greek mainland itself. The influences on Greek religion extended beyond local and ancestral traditions, however. Interaction with neighboring cultures, such as the Minoans, as well as the broader Near Eastern religions, particularly through Cyprus and Phoenicia, also shaped Greek religious beliefs. Well, I'm sure we've all heard of Herodotus, and if you haven't, he was a 5th century BC historian. Well, he attributed many Greek religious customs to Egyptian origins, certainly an old civilization too, with comparisons have also been drawn between Greek and Ugaritic and Canaanite mythologies. Canaanites are roughly around the area of modern-day Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, this area, suggesting shared motives and narratives that might help date seminal Greek epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, the theory of a prehistoric religion centered around a dominant great goddess, which was later supplanted by male-led Indo-European religious structures, has also been proposed for Greece, as well as for Minoan Crete. However, we must say that this hypothesis has fallen out of favor among specialists of our modern times, primarily due to insufficient evidence. The evidence that we do have is somewhat circumstantial, and piecing together things from those times, just from archaeological findings, I suppose we can say, well, it's a little bit difficult, so we don't want to jump to any conclusions that may seem a little far-fetched. Nevertheless, it must be said that the prominence of goddesses in Minoan art remains a point of interest, as there were a great many of them. If you want to know more about that, please go and watch my video on the Minoan civilization in the Bronze Age playlist. Now, by the era of those famous Homeric epics, that is, the works by Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the pantheon of the 12 Olympians, led by Zeus as the Sky Father, was very much established. These gods displayed characteristics that were typical of Indo-European deities. The integration of Dionysus into this group, evidenced in the later Homeric hymns, marked the culmination of this religious evolution, reflecting a synthesis of ancient traditions and newer cultic practices. During the archaic and classical periods in Greece, religion profoundly influenced civic life, leading to the construction of numerous temples. I'm sure you know all about them, dotted around the ancient landscape of Greece, in ruins now, of course. But they did showcase a uniform architectural style across various city-states. Like we said, that this religion seemed to be a unifying force when they couldn't quite agree on other things. Well, the temples not only served religious functions, but they also became central to the social and political life of the cities. Thus, the Greek religion was deeply intertwined with local governance, with priests typically coming from the elite classes. The development of Greek sculpture was significantly driven by religious themes also, which, while it was pivotal, did not seem to similarly influence Greek painting, which is now, unfortunately, lost to history. Throughout Greece, large-scale sanctuaries gained pan-Hellenic status, attracting visitors from across the Greek world and fostering a sense of Greek national identity. This word pan-Hellenic. Hellenic essentially refers to anything Greek, so the Hellenic people, the Hellenic era, and pan just means many. So pan-Hellenic essentially means many Greek. I suppose we can translate it to that. Well, these sanctuaries played a crucial role of their own in the collective religious and cultural consciousness, a meeting place for all Greeks, whether they be from Sparta, Athens, Corinth. It didn't matter. Everybody came to the temple. However, the traditional religious practices faced scrutiny and criticism from the emerging Greek philosophical traditions, which introduced new ethical concepts that, frankly, conflicted with the existing polytheistic beliefs. Early philosophers like Xenophanes criticized the moral character and anthropomorphic representations of the Olympian gods, and Plato proposed the existence of a single supreme deity, as he called it, the form of the good, representing ultimate perfection in the universe. His student Aristotle, however, rejected the existence of multiple deities due to a lack of empirical evidence. He instead posited a prime mover, a kind of detached creator. Thus, the Hellenistic period saw further evolution in Greek religion, influenced by the expansive conquests of Alexander the Great and the ensuing cultural challenges that came with it. Lavish temple constructions by the Diadochi, that is, Alexander's successors, were common, with rulers often seeking to integrate themselves into religious cults, a practice facilitated in regions like Egypt, where deified monarchs were already customary. This era also witnessed the introduction of foreign deities, such as Isis, Atargatis, and Cybele into Greek religion, reflecting the period's increasing cultural syncretism, if one could use that word. Philosophical schools like Platonism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism gained prominence, offering spiritual insights that sometimes diverged from traditional religious practices. The creation of Serapis by Ptolemy I exemplifies the political and cultural synthesis of the period. Moreover, new religious and philosophical movements like Orphism and Pythagoreanism began to question traditional practices such as animal sacrifice, advocating for a more humane approach to spirituality. Hellenistic astrology also emerged as a popular practice towards the end of this period, providing another layer to that already rich tapestry of Greek religious life. But despite these transformations, traditional Greek religious festivals, myths, and practices only continued, though their influence was gradually diminished, both by the educated elite and the general populace. When the Roman Republic conquered Greece in 146 BC, it absorbed much of the Greek culture, including its religion, literary styles, and architectural methods. The syncretism between Greek and Roman religion involved equating Greek deities with Roman ones. For example, Zeus with Jupiter, Hera with Juno, Poseidon with Neptune, and, well, any others that followed suit. Deities like Apollo and Bacchus had been incorporated into Roman culture even before this formal equivalence was established. However, unique Roman gods such as Janus and Quirinus remained distinct, without any Greek equivalents. In terms of temple construction in Greece, the Romans focused primarily on building temples for their imperial cult, which was established in every significant city. You couldn't have a city without one, of course. Other contributions to religious architecture during this period were sparse, as Greece already had an abundance of sanctuaries. The most significant Roman contributions to temple architecture outside Italy may be attributed to Emperor Antoninus Pius. It was he who commissioned the construction of the Temple of Bacchus in Baalbek. The temple stands as one of the most impressive relics from that imperial period. Roman rule also saw the frequent removal of famous statues from Greek sanctuaries, which were often replaced with contemporary Roman copies. This practice was exemplified by Verres, the Roman governor of Sicily, who was notable for his depredations and was prosecuted for his actions after his term ended. He was not very popular. Well, as the Roman Empire expanded, it also facilitated the spread of new cults from Egypt and Asia, which found popularity both within Greece and across the wider Western Empire, further diversifying the religious landscape. Now, the initial decline of Greco-Roman polytheism was partly due to its syncretic nature, as it absorbed beliefs and practices from various foreign religions amid the Roman Empire's expansion. This period also saw Greco-Roman philosophical schools incorporating elements from Judaism and early Christianity. Mystery religions like Christianity and Mithraism, which were pretty much the same thing, gained popularity, further diluting traditional polytheistic practices. Now, the shift towards Christianity gained significant momentum under Emperor Constantine I, who converted to Christianity and enacted the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, granting official tolerance to Christianity within the empire. Despite this official sanction, pagan and Christian communities in Greece and elsewhere generally remained segregated, each maintaining distant cultural practices and places of worship. Julian, a nephew of Constantine and later known as the Apostate, attempted to reverse the Christianization of the empire. You see, Julian, he was raised a Christian, but Christianity was new and, well, you know, teenagers rebelling against their parents. He decided to revert to paganism and sought to revive a unified version of the Greco-Roman polytheism based on Neoplatonism. He organized a centralized priesthood and established a coherent body of doctrine, rituals, and liturgy. Julian also marginalized Christianity by excluding Christian educators from using classical Greco-Roman texts, aiming to weaken Christianity's intellectual foundations. But despite Julian's efforts, subsequent emperors such as Jovian, Valentinian I, and Valens continued policies of religious tolerance. However, official persecution of paganism in the Eastern Empire began in earnest under Emperor Theodosius I in 381 CE, pulling that reverse card on them, it seems. While Theodosius enforced strict anti-pagan laws, leading to the disbanding of priesthoods, destruction of temples, and active participation in Christian campaigns against pagan sites. He even extended prohibitions of pagan worship to private homes. That's right, you weren't even allowed to do it in your own bedroom. Well, maybe they wouldn't see you anyway if you just closed the shutters. But this likely played a role in ending the Olympic Games in 393, which were kind of seen as a big old pagan party. Well, in the Western Roman Empire, Emperor Gratian, influenced by his advisor Ambrose, ended the unofficial tolerance of paganism that had persisted since Julian's reign. Gratian confiscated the incomes and properties of pagan priests, disbanded religious orders like the Vestal Virgins, and seized the properties of temples. Despite these suppressive measures, worship of Greco-Roman deities continued in some rural and remote areas well into the Middle Ages. Notably, a temple to Apollo at Monte Cassino persisted until 529 AD, when St. Benedict of Nursia converted it into a Christian chapel, destroyed the pagan altar, and even cut down the sacred grove. Similarly, pagan communities like the Maniots in Greece's Mani Peninsula continued their traditional practices until at least the 9th century. Well, we've talked a bit about the history, the start and the finish, but there's all those little details in between. What did an actual practitioner of Greek religion do? Practitioner rather. Zeus will smite me for that one, I'm sure. Well, let's get into the specifics, all the juicy little details then, shall we? Well, the religious landscape of ancient Greece in general was marked by a notable lack of centralized authority over religious practices and beliefs, which were regulated predominantly at the local or civic level, rather than through any unified ecclesiastical system. So it wasn't like when Catholicism came in and you had the Pope dictating what everybody could do and there was a right way to be a Catholic. Well, in ancient Greece there wasn't really a right or wrong way to be a pagan, or whatever they were going to call you, a worshipper of Zeus, or whatever else it was. You just sort of had to put in a bit of effort. Just show up. And then they'll work out the rest later. It was about the big picture for them, not the little details. And this decentralized nature meant that this term, religion, might not wholly capture the essence of the spiritual and ceremonial practices of the Greeks. Instead, these practices could be more accurately described as a collection of, well, we could say, religious dialects. Kind of the same, but a little different from place to place. Each city-state or polis, that was city or town, had its own version of these dialects, developing and maintaining its own rituals, deities and temples, which were deeply integrated into the social and political fabric of the community. These local religious practices and beliefs were closely aligned with each other across different regions of Greece, showcasing a kind of homogeneity that was distinctly Greek and highly differentiated from those of non-Greek cultures. This framework of understanding allows for a more nuanced appreciation of the ancient Greek religious experience as a complex and interconnected web of localized spiritual traditions, rather than a single organized religion. There wasn't really a top-down structure. Well, it was inherently polytheistic, though. That was what they all had in common, and incorporated a rich tapestry of gods and goddesses and other supernatural beings, each with specific domains and attributes. That's right, there wasn't just one. Of course, there were always hierarchies, depending on who you asked, but you got all sorts of characters, and I think it's pretty fun that way. Well, at the pinnacle of this divine hierarchy, of course, sat the king of the gods, Zeus, who, while influential, was not omnipotent or omniscient. And below him were deities like Poseidon, who ruled the seas and earthquakes, which is of course pretty important when you're living around the Greek islands. And then you had Hades, who governed the underworld, and Helios, who commanded the sun. These gods were imagined in human form, but possessed the ability to transform into animals or even natural phenomena. Their immortality, however, did not exempt them from their fates, known as the Moirai, whose decrees could limit the gods' actions. For example, despite the gods' interventions, it was fated for Odysseus to return to Ithaca after the Trojan War, and no divine power could prevent it. The gods in Greek mythology exhibited human-like behaviors and emotions, often interacting with humans and sometimes even fathering children with them, and they were known as demigods. Think of Hercules. You remember the show with Kevin Sorbo? Ah, that was great growing up with that one. Xena, too. Moving on. You must like the video if you watched Hercules. Well, these divine beings, these demigods, were not only involved in the affairs of mortals, but also had their own conflicts and rivalries, just like all of the main gods, as depicted in epic narratives like the Iliad, where even the gods argued amongst each other and took sides in the Trojan War. Each major god was associated with specific geographical locations. Athena with Athens, hence the name, Apollo with Delphi and Delos, Zeus with Olympia, and Aphrodite with Corinth. However, their worship was not confined to these cities alone, as each city had temples dedicated to various gods. Moreover, some deities had connections with regions beyond Greece, like Poseidon with Ethiopia, and Troy with Ares and Thrace. The cult of these gods varied significantly from one location to another, reflecting local traditions and interpretations. For instance, the Artemis worshipped in Sparta was a virgin huntress, differed markedly from the fertility goddess Artemis of Ephesus, characterized by her many breasts. This diversity highlights the localized nature of Greek religion, where the identity of a deity was closely tied to specific cultural contexts. Now, Greek religious practice focused more on the correct performance of rituals rather than the adherence to a formal creed. What mattered most, the most important thing, was participation. You had to show up in the communal practices that honored the gods, and this was a lot more important than any personal belief. There wasn't any real 10 commandments. None of that to be seen. It was more of a community thing. Now, the ancient Greeks held complex beliefs about the afterlife. That was a big deal, centered around the underworld that was known as Hades, named after its ruler, the god Hades, who was actually Zeus's brother. Plot twists already, I know. This realm was not merely a single monolithic place, but was differentiated into several areas, reflecting the variety of fates that could befall the souls of the dead. And I know you all want to hear about the Greek hell, so we'll just talk about it briefly. Well, Hades, traditionally, all souls ventured here after death. All of them. Good guys, bad guys, everyone. You just had to go there. And it was a gloomy and shadowy place where all the spirits resided. Next was Tartarus. This was the deepest and darkest pit beneath the earth. Pretty scary. Where the Titans were imprisoned and eternal punishments were meted out upon the wicked, and it symbolized extreme torment and suffering. You did not want to end up here in Tartarus. And then, of course, there was Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, which was the complete opposite of Tartarus, and was the place that you wanted to go. It was a place of paradise, reserved for heroes and those who lived a righteous life. It was the land of eternal happiness and contentment. Sounds pretty good. Well, in the mythological stories, certain heroes and noble figures were believed to have been granted physical immortality and lived forever in blissful places like Elysium or the islands of the blessed. This group included famed personalities such as Achilles and Menelaus. Such tales permeate the oldest strata of Greek mythology, found in the epics of Homer and the works of Hesiod, and these beliefs persisted robustly even into the era of early Christianity. For most ordinary Greeks, however, the prospect of death was typically to continue existing as a disembodied soul. The existence was not marked by physical pleasures or pains of earthly life, but was just a shadowy form of half-life in the underworld. Of course, this, well, it varied from region to region, but the general idea was as I've just said. Additionally, the concept of reincarnation found its way into Greek thought through the teachings of philosophers like Pythagoras and Plato. This notion suggested that the soul could be reborn into new bodies across different lifetimes, a belief that was not universally accepted, influenced various philosophical and religious schools in Greece. On the other end of the spectrum, the philosopher Epicurus introduced a materialistic view, teaching that the soul was composed of tiny little atoms that disbanded after death, thereby extinguishing consciousness and existence. The view underscored the finality of death, with no continuation of the self in any form, which was a stark departure from the traditional views on the afterlife. It reminds me somewhat of how Alan Watts had explained it in his old lectures, and I am sorry to go off topic, but effectively what Alan Watts, that philosopher, had said, in a paraphrased version of course, is if you want to know the experience of being dead, well, you must think of going to sleep and then never waking up. And then when you want to think about that, you may also want to think about waking up without having gone to sleep. And you've all done that. That was when you were born. And what did it feel like to wake up after having never gone to sleep? Well, maybe death is just like that. This zero consciousness state. Anyway, maybe a video on Alan Watts in the future. It's somewhat related to our topic, maybe. I'm getting off topic now. Very unprofessional of me. Well, of course, we have to go back to Greek mythology, which when we use the term mythology, I suppose we should be a little bit careful about it, because it's only mythology when it's the old religion. Perhaps in 1,000 years' time, we will be talking about Buddhist mythology, Christian mythology, Jewish mythology, Muslim mythology. Perhaps they will not be scriptures anymore, but simply old stories that just sit on the shelf right next to the Greek myths. Maybe so. We'll have to check back in 1,000 years. But either way, Greek mythology was a cornerstone of ancient Greek religion, and it's a rich tapestry, I'm sure you know. Gods, heroes, and extraordinary creatures. Well, let's start with some of those gods and heroes. Of course, at the head of the myths were all the main characters from Olympus: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Athena, and many more, who interacted with humans and frequently intervened and meddled in their affairs, sometimes simply for their own entertainment, but often driven by their own divine whims and familial disputes. Heroes, both mortal and demigods, such as Hercules with his 12 labors, Odysseus with his ingenious return from Troy, and Theseus who defeated the Minotaur, or Minotaur, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Well, they all played pivotal roles. These stories often explored themes of bravery, morality, and simply the human condition, serving both as entertainment and moral lessons. The mythology was also included an array of fantastical creatures. Titans like Cronus and Oceanus were part of an older generation of gods who preceded even the Olympians. Mythical beings like the centaurs, the nymphs, the satyrs, along with terrifying monsters such as the Cyclops, Scylla, and the Gorgons, and don't forget the Minotaur, added layers of drama and danger to the myths, embodying the Greeks' explanations of the natural world and its phenomena. Now, regarding the origins of the world and the gods, Greek cosmogony varied widely, with no uniform version. Now, Hesiod's Theogony offered one of the most detailed accounts, beginning with chaos and followed by the emergence of primordial deities like Gaia, Earth, Tartarus, the Abyss, and Eros, Love, who then produced the Titans. This older generation of gods eventually gave way to the Olympians, leading to a divine succession myth that underscored the Greeks' understanding of a universe ruled by order and chaos. These myths were initially transmitted orally, and later they were immortalized in written form through epic poems like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and Hesiod's works. They also found expression in classical Greek drama, with playwrights like Euripides and Aristophanes weaving these stories into their plays. Thus, Greek mythology not only entertained, but it offered explanations for the mysteries of life and the universe, questions that people didn't know how to answer, so they just came up with something interesting. Well, at least it provided the ancient Greeks with a framework for understanding the human experience. Well, as Greek culture was assimilated into the Roman Empire later on, Greek gods and myths were adapted into the Roman context, with many being equated as Roman deities. This syncretism extended the life of Greek myths and ensured the survival into the Roman period and beyond. In fact, during the Renaissance, many years later, a renewed interest in classical learning saw Greek mythology re-emerge as a significant source of inspiration for art, literature, philosophy, influencing generations of European artists and thinkers. In fact, I am going to say that it is my personal opinion, and I believe it is the correct one, that Renaissance art was the best and is the best. I won't look at anything past the First World War. I just don't like it. Anyway, the concept of hubris was integral to ancient Greek moral philosophy, representing the dangerous extremes of pride and arrogance. It was particularly frowned upon because it often involved acts that could harm others or offend the gods. Stupid bravery is different from noble bravery. We're talking inappropriate displays of pride, acts of violence, and disrespect for the natural order, throwing your weight around. Nobody likes that. Hubris actually was legally punishable in cities like Athens, where it was defined broadly to include acts ranging from violence to the improper treatment of corpses. Well, the Greeks highly valued moderation. Most of them, some of them more than others, of course, embodying the ideal in the famous maxim, nothing in excess. This principle was applied across various aspects of Greek life, from eating and drinking to the exercise of power and display of one's abilities. Activities like athletics and intellectual pursuits were of course encouraged, excuse me. But of course they were always only encouraged within the bounds of moderation, emphasizing a balanced lifestyle that prevented any single aspect from becoming all-consuming. Well, unlike many other ancient cultures, the Greeks did not rely on a centralized, revealed scripture, but instead looked to a broad corpus of literature for moral and spiritual guidance. Works by Homer, such as the Iliad and Odyssey, and Hesiod's Theogony and works were considered authoritative, though not necessarily sacred. These texts, along with the lyrical poems of Pindar and others, often began with invocations to the Muses, reflecting a belief in divine inspiration, albeit not in the form of direct revelation. Plato's ambivalence towards traditional mythologies, as expressed in his Republic, shows once again the tension between the revered place these classical texts in Greek culture and their perceived moral deficiencies. He argued for the exclusion of such myths from his ideal state, due to their potential to mislead rather than properly guide moral behavior. While most Greek religious texts were not canonical in the sense understood in other religious traditions, certain texts within the mystery cults were held as canonical. These texts, used in specific rituals, are exceptions to the general Greek practice of not regarding any text as strictly sacred. The Orphic texts, for instance, offer a glimpse into these more structured religious beliefs and practices that stood somewhat apart from mainstream Greek religious and philosophical life. In ancient Greece, the absence of a centralized religious authority, or a unified priestly class even, led to a diverse and localized religious expression. Decentralization meant that the religious texts and rituals varied significantly from one city-state to another, and even from one village to another, influenced largely by the local traditions and customs rather than any theological and rigid doctrine. Priests in Greece often served concurrently as city magistrates, and their religious authority was typically derived from local sanctuaries rather than a centralized church or temple. Notably, Pausanias mentions that at Tegea, the priesthood of Athena Allia was traditionally held by a boy until he reached puberty, highlighting the local and often temporary nature of priestly roles. Well, at least it's an early retirement, one could say. Well, in many cases, priestly responsibilities, especially those related to specific festivals or rituals, were passed down through families, once more emphasizing the local and familial nature of Greek religious practice. And Greek religious rites were predominantly conducted at altars, located outside the temples or in open spaces within the community. These altars, dedicated to specific deities, were central to public and private worship. Common offerings included votive deposits such as food, drinks, and valuable items, reflecting the reciprocal nature of worship where goods were exchanged for divine favor. A sacrifice. You know what it's like. But of course, some sacrifices were bigger than others. You know what I'm talking about. Animal sacrifices. A key aspect, but perhaps a rather unfortunate one of Greek ritual practice, were also performed at these altars. Now, typically the meat from the sacrificed animals was consumed by the community. They didn't just leave it there for the gods to take and expect it to float away into the air. Perhaps they tried this, but it didn't seem to happen. Well, of course, as I said, the meat was consumed by the community after, but the offal and all of the other unpleasant bits were burned as offerings to the gods. Libations, usually of wine, were another common practice, integral not only to formal ceremonies at shrines, but also to daily activities such as meals and symposiums, where they functioned as both religious and social acts. There were also special rites of passage. The Amphidromia, for example, was celebrated on the 5th or 7th day of a child's birth, particularly significant in Athens for male children, emphasizing the importance of lineage and citizenship. Another ritual, the Pharmakos, involved expelling a human or animal scapegoat from the community during times of distress or hardship. This ritual expulsion was intended to protect the community by removing evil or pollution along with the scapegoat, a practice that underscores the ancient Greeks' concerns with purity and disaster aversion. The act of worship was a communal and ceremonious event centered around animal sacrifices conducted at the outdoor altars, which could be independent of or associated with a temple. The ritual began with a procession, led by a girl carrying a basket with the hidden sacrificial knife, followed by the animal, adorned with garlands. The chosen animal, which needed to be without blemish, showed the community's dedication to the gods, a gift just for them. Well, during the ceremony, the animal was slaughtered directly over the altar, its blood collected and poured out as an offering. The slaughter was accompanied by the high-pitched cries of the women, an expression of the emotional intensity of the moment, and perhaps as well so the gods could hear them. The carcass was then butchered right there on the spot. The inedible parts, like bones and organs, were thrown on the fire as the gods' share, while the meat was cooked and shared among the participants. A communal feast that followed was always part of the sacrificial act, and the temple typically claimed the animal's skin as a valuable byproduct. Gotta make a little bit of money, don't we? The choice of animals for sacrifices varied too. Sheep were the most common, and they were the easiest to find, followed by goats, pigs, and cattle, while horses and donkeys were rare and featured mostly in early Greek art rather than literature. The gods often anthropomorphized the sacrificed animals as willing participants in the ritual, a notion that showed the supposed mutual benefit and consent to the divine order. Simpler offerings might include throwing a grain of incense into a sacred fire, especially in more personal or less grandiose settings. Farmers often offered their first fruits of the harvest as a token of thanks to the gods. Everyday activities like drinking wine could also be ritualized through libations, where a small portion of the wine was poured out before drinking as an offering to the deities. One for them, one for me. Formal libations could involve other substances like olive oil or honey, and were part of larger religious ceremonies conducted at the temples. On grand occasions, such as major festivals, the scale of sacrifice could be vast, with the term hecatomb indicating a large number of bulls being offered, though in practice this might only mean a dozen or so. Now, back to ancient Greek literature for a moment, with things like Homer's epic poems, Iliad and the Odyssey, providing substantive evidence of ritualistic sacrificial practices embedded within the fabric of Greek society. These epics detail occasions where sacrifices were made to gain favor to the gods, celebrate successes in war, or even seek divine guidance before major endeavors, such as the Greeks' expedition to Troy. For instance, in the Odyssey, the character Eumaeus offers a pig in sacrifice, praying for the safe return of his master Odysseus. The Iliad depicts banquets that do not always begin with a sacrifice, suggesting variability in ritual practice across different contexts and periods. This variance in ritual practice shows the adaptive and localized nature of Greek religious observance once again, tailoring it to the specific circumstances and indications of divine presence. Thus, the distinctions between Olympic and chthonic deities in Greek religion is reflected in their modes of worship. Chthonic deities associated with the earth and the underworld often received holocaust sacrifices, where the entire offering was consumed by fire. This practice is thought to be a remnant of pre-Hellenic religious traditions. In contrast, the more familiar Olympian gods worshipped by the Proto-Greeks, but typically rather received offerings that were partly consumed by fire and partly by the community. But what about the festivals? They loved a good party, didn't they? Well, they also varied significantly. and they were often dedicated to specific deities or city-states. The Lacaia in Arcadia honored Pan, for example, the pastoral god, while the Olympic Games in Olympia were a major celebration dedicated to Zeus. The Dionysia in Athens, a festival centered around Greek theater, represents another significant cultural and religious celebration. Common elements of these festivals included processions, sacrificial feasts, and communal meals, alongside entertainment and social customs such as wearing costumes and engaging in public revelry. In layman's terms, everybody got really drunk and had a good time. These festivals not only served as religious purposes, but also reinforced the social bonds and community identities. In fact, some cities, like Athens for example, dedicated up to 140 days per year to various religious observances, which certainly seems like something Athens would do. I don't think the Spartans were doing that much. Now, ancient Greek sanctuaries, encompassing more than just the main temple structures, were typically situated within a larger sacred area. This was known as a temenos, which was often enclosed by a peribolos wall or fence. This entire area, dedicated to a deity, included not only the temple itself, but often a variety of subsidiary structures and natural features, such as sacred groves, springs, and sometimes even caves or unique rocks known as baetils. The Acropolis of Athens is one of the most renowned examples of such a sanctuary, though its initial fortifications were intended more for protection rather than religious purposes. Over time, as the significance of these sites grew, they evolved from simple open-air altars located in natural surroundings into more complex establishments, featuring built temples housing cult images of the gods. The primary function of the temple buildings themselves was to house these sacred images rather than to serve as gathering places for worshippers. The actual religious activities, including sacrifices and rituals, were conducted outdoors at designated altars within the sanctuary's precincts, especially the animal sacrifice ones. You can be as pious as you want, but no one wants to clean up that mess. Well, this setup allowed the temple interiors to remain relatively clear, turning them into revered spaces that accumulated votive offerings, statues, and even treasures, reflecting the wealth and devotion of their patrons. Essentially, they were kind of like early museums. You can only imagine. Furthermore, some sanctuaries were renowned for their oracular services, offering divine guidance through human intermediaries believed to be inspired by the gods. The most famous of these were the Pythia, a priestess at the temple of Apollo in Delphi, and the oracles at the sanctuary of Zeus in Dodona. These oracles played significant roles in public and private life across the ancient Greek world, providing counsel on everything from political affairs to personal and agricultural issues. Less famous oracles, such as that of the hero of Trophonius at Livadeia, specialized in more specific domains like medicine or agriculture. Greek temples were constructed as the divine residences of the gods, each housing a cult image within the inner chamber, or the cella as it was called, which often depicted the deity of the temple. These images varied greatly in form and material, ranging from wooden figures to elaborate statues adorned with ivory and gold, such as the renowned statue of Zeus at Olympia, or Phidias's Athena Parthenos in the Parthenon. Over time, materials such as marble, terracotta, and bronze became more popular, especially in the later Hellenistic period. The cella, inner chamber, remember, also contained simpler symbolic representations, like the zoanon, a primitive wooden image, and the beitil, sacred stones believed to possess divine powers. These simpler forms were sometimes ancient and revered for their antiquity, and when newer, more elaborate statues served as the main cult image. These older symbols, such as the Trojan Palladium, a zoanon that was believed to protect Troy, were valued for their historical and religious significance. The accessibility of these sacred images varied significantly across the different locales and periods. While earlier beliefs restricted access to the cella primarily to priests, later practices became a lot more inclusive, although often regulated by local customs or the perceived desires of the deities. Restrictions could be based on factors such as gender, ethnicity, or even dietary choices. Those who put pineapple on their pizza were strictly forbidden. I'm just joking. While some temples only accessible on specific days or to certain classes of people. So you had to be there at the right time, I suppose. Visitors, including common people and slaves, generally expected to gain entry into the temple's inner sanctum to pray or make offerings directly before the cult image. In some instances, touching the statue was part of the devotional practice, as noted by Cicero, who observed a bronze statue of Hercules worn down by the touches of worshippers. In ancient Greece, the public roles available to women were predominantly religious ones, serving as priestesses or attendants within various cults and temples. These roles provided women with notable social recognition and certain privileges not typically afforded to other women of the time. Priestesses, often selected from local elite families, could serve in various capacities, from sacred women to lesser attendants. Women serving as priestesses were required to be healthy and of sound mind, reflecting the belief that those serving the gods should mirror the quality of their offerings. This position, while restricted in terms of eligibility, granted women a higher legal status as well, both during their service and posthumously, often with the honor of a public burial. While it is debated whether service was gender-specific to certain deities, generally both male and female deities could be served by either priests or priestesses. However, the roles could be gendered in specific rituals and practices. For example, the Pythia, or female oracle of Apollo at Delphi, was a priestess but was overseen by male priests. Similarly, the festival of Dionysus involved both genders, with special roles designated for female priestesses known as the Gerei, or the Venerable Ones. But certain festivals in ancient Greece were for women only, often linked to agricultural fertility and the traditional roles that women played within society. These included the Thesmophoria, the Plerosia, Calamia, Adonia, and Scyra. Well, the Thesmophoria, for example, was one of the most significant, dedicated to Demeter and her daughter Persephone, goddess of agriculture and fertility. The festival not only reinforced the agricultural identity and duties of women, but also integrated those celebrations into the fabric of city-state religious practices. These women-only festivals were crucial in providing a religious identity and purpose for women in society, where many aspects of public life were dominated by men. Temples and shrines specific to these festivals, such as the Thesmophorion in Athens, were central venues where women could engage in rituals and worship. The mystery religions, however, offered a more intimate and personal approach to spirituality compared to the more public and civic-oriented practices of traditional religion. These cults, for example, required initiation, providing a secretive and often profound spiritual experience that promised deeper insights into the divine and the cosmos. Initiates of mystery religions could experience profound personal transformations and mystical awakenings that were not typically accessible in the public cults of the gods. Unlike the more fragmented and localized traditional practices, mystery religions often offered a more systematic and cohesive set of beliefs and teachings. They frequently provided detailed beliefs about the afterlife, offering assurances of salvation or an improved fate beyond death, which appealed to many who found the traditional Greek views on the afterlife as, well, frankly a little lackluster. Although initiation was personal and secretive, once you were in, you participated in common rituals that fostered a sense of belonging and spiritual community as a sort. The bonds formed within these cults were strong, with fellow initiates often forming close-knit communities of believers who supported one another, not just in their spiritual journeys, but in practical ways too. Now, the four major mystery cults were as following. The first was the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was based in Eleusis. These were perhaps the most famous of the Greek mystery cults, centered around the worship of Demeter and Persephone. Initiates were promised rewards in the afterlife, and were privy to the dramatic reenactments of the myths of Persephone's descent and return from the underworld. The next was the mysteries of Dionysus. These rites were more ecstatic and unrestrained, often involving symbolic death and rebirth rituals, wine-fueled ecstasy, and the breaking of social norms. While Dionysus himself was a god of life, death, and rebirth, embodying the intoxicating power of nature and wine. The next was the Samothracian Mysteries, and admittedly less is known about these rites, but they were thought to offer protection at sea, and possibly initiation into a complex set of deities and symbolic stories centered on themes of protection and salvation. The last one is Mithraism. This cult, originating in the East, became extremely popular among Roman soldiers, and was later practiced widely across the Roman Republic and Empire, focusing on the god Mithras, and featuring rituals associated with fellowship, the cosmos, and a hierarchical structure of initiation levels. And with that, we reach the end of our video, at least for now. I'm sure there'll be more videos on the Greek myths coming soon. I'd like to thank my top tier patrons, Charles, Dark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, Wendy, Tim, James, Aaron, Scott. All lovely people. Thank you very much. And you too, dear listener, thank you for joining me so far. I do appreciate it. Those who are listening at the wait for it, hour and 10-minute mark, how good was that? You certainly are a special group of people. And in case no one's told you today, you're doing fine out there. And it's all gonna be all right. As long as we stick together. Good night, everybody. Lots of love to you all. And get a good rest. Please. See you in the next video.